Hey folks, it's one of the Layman Pascals here on behalf of the Integral Stage, Bruce Alderman, myself, and all of you. Today we're going to dive into the meta crisis with a guy I keep running into at all the secret integral Illuminati mask and cloak parties. Roger Walsh is a man's man, ladies' man, man about town, scholarly wisdom theorist, spiritual practitioner, and he's been, in my view, an essential intellectual, social, and energetic participant across the trans-rationalist communities for years. And if this was an interview, I'd spend even more time praising him absurdly at the beginning, but he's asked that this be an open conversation. So here to explore the meta crisis with me and any other pathways that open up for us is a fellow for whom I have a lot of instinctive affection. It's Roger Walsh. Hi, Roger.
Hi, thanks, Layman. Hey, gee, I have a lot of instinctive affection for you too, even though we've only met for a matter of minutes in actual dialogue, but we seem to be working the same street. And,
okay, well, we've both come to the right place.
All right.
What do you think of when you think of the meta crisis? What does that word mean to you? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think of the defining and great challenge and issue of our time. I think that this is the general issue of human survival has been an issue that has kept just challenging any of us who think, and me in particular for over 40 years now, since I was quite young. And I first went to Asia to meditate in Burma and also to work in Mother Teresa's centers. And I was just horrified by the extent of poverty and seeing all these diseases, which I'd never seen except as pictures in my medical textbooks. And I was just horrified realizing all these people suffering from absolutely treatable diseases. And then shortly after I came back, I saw the film The Last Epidemic on what a nuclear war would do to us, and just blew me out of the water. And both times I realized I had the sense, how could I have been so asleep? How could I have lived my life in anesthetic comfort in a very beautiful world that I live in, but being so asleep to the enormity of the suffering in the world and the enormous dangers we face? So that's been a kind of koan or question for me ever since. And at times it fades out of awareness as my defenses rise and I push it out of awareness. And other times, like now, it comes back to the fore. And so I just welcome this chance to have a dialogue about it with you.
Yeah, it's interesting when we look at our kids, I feel like, what world are they going to inhabit? And they tell me things about the world they think they're going to inhabit. And it sounds like the apocalypse, but I noticed that I already felt that my whole life as well. From a very young age, just aware that something is going wrong and spiraling out of control. And if I had to intellectually try to define the way I think about it, we've got not just a crisis to solve, but multiple crises across multiple domains, right? There's a mental health crisis and a biodiversity crisis, poverty, disease, climate, meaning crisis, weapons of mass destruction, uncontrolled, disastrous capitalism, destabilizing technological innovations, all of these things coming together at roughly the same moment. But it's more than just the assembly of all these crises that are simultaneous. It's the sense that they're interlinked, that they co-generate, that they're sourced in some common set of habits of mind and behavior. And I think that it's whatever this all is emerging, but also is already underway. That it's the things that it's sourced in our ancient habits of the human species that have been amplified by modernity and now are threatening the entire background system, that its modernity's successes are in a way threatening its own background, and that it's accompanied by a certain mood, a kind of strangeness, a peculiarity, a difficulty in coming to peace with the way that the world is in front of us. So for me, it's all of these things. It's a set of interlinked crises. It's a set of drivers of these crises, which are intrinsic to our civilization, but have been amplified with our new technological powers, and a sense that it's both ancient and ongoing, but also about to become massively more significant, that it's bubbling up and arising in front of us.
I would agree with all of that, Layman. And it's been interesting for me now that I'm diving back into the various crises and threats to civilization that we face. Because I first started writing this shortly after I came back from Asia and was faced with this painful recognition of my own blindness and asleepness about these issues. And so I wrote a book at that time on the psychology of human survival. And what strikes me now, going back into the threats, is first, there are just more of them, and second, they're accelerating faster. My first book was primarily, not exclusively, but primarily about the nuclear threat, and it was a grave one, and still is. But now it feels like so many other things have reached potential tipping points, and they're interacting in painful positive feedback loops, that things are just way more complex, way more urgent, and vaster scale. And on the positive side, there are a lot more people working on this now. When I first wrote my book, I was one of a small minority of people deeply concerned about these issues. Now it feels like a significant percentage of people are aware of at least some of these issues, some of the threats we face, and a significant number of people devoting their lives to ameliorating them. That's the positive side.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the response that this evokes in people. And I think part of that response is what we point to as integrative or game B or meta-modern communities, people who are very clear about the fact that our thinking and our way of being has to be transformed in the face of these patterns. And part of that response is, kind of motivating anxiety, which can go wrong, can be overwhelming, but also can mobilize people toward action. And, it's a different question whether that action is very useful or not. But I'm thinking of, and because I mentioned just before we started recording how I thought you looked a bit like Heidegger. Heidegger has this essay on the age of the world picture. And I think he says in that essay that when you perceive the threat to the whole system, that's when you begin for the first time to care for the whole system, right? That anxiety about what could happen to the whole world or the whole species or everything that we base ourselves on, that evokes a quality that could be a special kind of care, a special kind of compassion, that's almost like the whole system waking up to itself, feeling care for itself. But I want to be very cautious because that awakening is not magic. We're still in a very dangerous situation, even though we're starting to feel for that situation.
Yeah, and what you're pointing to, Layman, is clearly a psychological potential, a developmental potential, which I'm sure we'll want to get into, because you have the habit of dropping so many ideas so quickly that I want to start taking notes and thinking, oh, we could go that road, this road. But one of the things you've implied just in passing a couple of times is that if we look deeply enough, we recognize that to a large extent, this is a crisis of psychology and spirit, in the sense that our technology is now so awesome, we have the power of gods, that the state of the world now reflects the state of our minds. And what we call our global crises are actually global symptoms. They're symptoms of our individual and collective psychological dysfunctions and diseases and immaturities and neuroses. And what that implies is that to heal our crises, our meta-crisis, whatever names we want to give it, implies that we need to not only work on the external, quotes, symptoms to relieve hunger, to reduce nuclear stockpiles, to reduce ecological degradation and topsoil loss, but we also need to work on ameliorating and maturing the psychological dysfunctions and immaturities that got us into this. And as you mentioned, these are ancient principles. And we can find these principles enunciated in Buddhist and Hindu texts from 2,500 years ago. So Yes, and these are still with us, but as you said, amplified to unprecedented degrees by our technological powers. We've become nuclear giants and technological wizards while remaining ethical infants and wisdom dwarfs. So we have much work to do in many arenas. Maybe, Layman, it would be worth just having a realize that we've dived in. You've listed several or many of the crises we face, and there's a long additional list. But maybe it would be just useful to take a moment before we continue diving here, because it's so easy to get overwhelmed. As you said, the anxiety arises, and there's a challenge of how do we respond skillfully to anxiety and with anxiety rather than be overwhelmed by it. And so I'd like to point out at the very outset that it's easy to assume once you really dive into the data that, oh, hell, we're doomed. We can't pull this out of the fire. There are too many tipping points we've crossed or are crossing. There are too many dynamics at work. There's accelerating technology, et cetera, et cetera. And yet, we don't know. We really don't know how it's going to turn out, but we do know that it's up to us. And it's possible to take a whole range of attitudes towards the challenges we're facing, the social and global challenges, all the way from the doomsters and extinction people who say it's over, or the deep adaptation, we've got to adapt as best we can, all the way through to the techno-utopians who believe we'll invent our ways out of the crisis and that's all we'll have to do. And for me, it feels like it's easy to escape into those extremes. It takes a little more willingness to sit with the anxiety you mentioned, to acknowledge we don't know, and to acknowledge it's up to us, because that puts a responsibility on us. But the other side of the responsibility is also an opportunity. There is an opportunity for shifting things. And so I think it's very important to hold all of this within don't know mind, as the Zen people would say. And that, at least as I look at it, I don't know how it's going to turn out, but I don't see anything better to do with a life than to try to play my little part in alleviating it.
I think for people who are reasonably capable of metacognition, of holding things in a don't know mind and understanding the integrative plurality of their feelings and perspectives and how to embrace and not embrace all of those in a constructive balance, we could really appreciate how useful that is. But also it's a very lucky, very privileged position to be able to take that stance. And so I feel enormously sympathetic to what it would be like if I couldn't do that very well.
Yes. And that, again, you're pointing to the fact that even to hold this in optimal ways is a developmental challenge. And yes, so again, part of our work is how do we cultivate our own capacities and growth so as to hold this most skillfully and respond most skillfully, and how do we serve others in coming to their fullness of their potential and capacities also.
I think one of the really open questions about this is the degree to which people need or don't need to feel worse about it, to grieve their way through, right? Because it seems on the one hand that there's a bit of a temperamental choice about whether you want to feel very affected or whether you want to sort of double down on pragmatic, possibly optimistic solutions and strategies. And it's a little bit counterproductive to implementing new strategies to spend your time worrying about the situation. On the other hand, there's a strong argument that if you don't really let your heart break about this, that you're going to sabotage your strategies and technological solutions somewhere down the road without realizing it. And one of the things for me in the last couple of years, even though I've been concerned with this my whole life, my heart's broken a lot more about it in the last couple of years. And there's been a very, very liberating quality to that. I don't feel like I'm trapped. I feel like I'm set free to take action because I allowed the doom into myself as a fact, but without becoming fixated in that position.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I think to the extent that any of us can open to the extent of suffering and sadness that is already present in the world, in poverty, in wars, et cetera, and to let in the incomprehensible amount that may ensue if we don't remedy some of the challenges we're facing. It can be very healing, and I don't feel like I can suggest the optimal way for each individual, but I do know that there are principles that are valuable. And one of them is, if we're acting out of avoidance and contraction and avoiding our experience, that's probably not helpful. And if we can open to the extent that we are willing to open to our experience, perhaps with the help of others, people are also wrestling with this, with support groups, even in psychotherapy or in our spiritual practice, simply to meditate and open to the suffering. Because in the contemplative traditions, opening to suffering defenselessly is the doorway to compassion and to effective action. And for, say, Buddhists with their bodhisattva aspiration to awaken and cultivate their capacities as fully as possible in order to serve and awaken and heal as many others as fully as possible. It's the compassion which is the motivating force for that profound aspiration of service and awakening all beings. And maybe one of the most profound aspirations the human mind has ever come up with. But at its root is compassion, and the source of that compassion is exactly what you described happening for you over this last couple of years, that allowing oneself to open and feel the pain. Therein is born compassion.
One of the things that strikes me is how useful some elements of the integral framing have been for myself, without trying to be a salesman for any of that. I've been looking my whole life.
Oh, go ahead.
I don't mind. Every salesman says that at the beginning of his pitch. I've been very attentive, and you mentioned this earlier, to the external and the internal aspect of this. And I think a lot of people in our generation and the previous couple generations have faced this issue of, do I focus more on my inner development, or do I try to get involved in economics, politics, social change, things like that? And I think most of them have gone back and forth because they're both really significant. And that duality is really interesting. But the very simplistic notion of the quadrants brings a little bit more nuance to it for me. So that when I think about it, I go, I need at least these 4 types of solutions. There has to be a transformation of ourselves. There has to be a new kind of mood shared between us. We need some kind of social spirit that can move, a culture that moves toward the meta-crisis. There needs to be physical external solutions, and there needs to be a significant upgrade in the strategies, the interaction algorithms that we use in order to organize ourselves. And if we don't do all of those, then we don't really have a chance of handling this.
Beautifully said. And I remember the utopian novel Island by Aldous Huxley. And when the stranger stumbles onto the island and realizes what he's found, this utopia, he asks, well, how did you do it? Where do you start? And the islanders respond, we start everywhere at once. And I think that's what you're pointing to, that those of us who have been fortunate enough to be influenced by an integral theory and its recognition of the so-called 4 quadrants, the psychological, the outer world, the outer systems, and the inner culture, common to us all, have come to recognize that, oh yeah, they're interdependent, and all of them have to be, ideally, will be cultivated. And of course, ideally, all of, together, we will work to develop all four, to cultivate ourselves as instruments of service, to shift the culture, to do what we can in the external world, etc., society and individuals, and they're all interdependent. And there's a way, and you mentioned the kind of struggle of what's the appropriate balance. And I think it's important to recognize the nature of that question, because a number of the questions that emerge when we wrestle with these issues of the meta-crisis, or how the general questions of how do we serve most effectively? How do we become optimal instruments of service? How do we heal, family relationships? That these are wisdom questions. They're not knowledge questions. And that distinction has been very important for me. And the distinction is that a knowledge question looks for a factual one-time answer. Is it raining outside? Look at the window. End of question. No. Well, or in California today, yes. But wisdom questions are more like koans. They can best be asked many times. And each time you ask them, they have the potential for taking you deeper into yourself, deeper into the question, and deeper into life. And so these are wisdom questions. And the question, what's the optimal balance for me of inner work on myself, or external work on myself, developing my skills and capacities, becoming a better philosopher, sociologist, physician, cleaner, whatever it is. And how do I do that? How do I bring that, how should I pair that with my service? Those are wisdom questions. And we'll probably want to get into at some stage in the ways of integrating those, of which karma yoga is the classical one. So maybe down the line, we can come back to that one.
Yeah, I think wisdom is an essential part of this discussion. When I started my Substack a couple of years ago, I did a whole series of articles called Dharma as Education for the Meta-Crisis. And I would like to go there, but what I want to say first is something that's been on my mind very strong in the last couple of years is shamanism, or whatever shamanism represents to us, as a particular style of wisdom that might be appropriate to the meta-crisis. Because when I look at the set of problems we're facing, there's a consciousness problem, there's an embodiment problem, there's a left and right brain problem, there's an ecology problem, there's a need for a kind of wisdom that's particularly oriented to locating people in their bodies, resetting the human ecology relationship, appreciating even non-human intelligence networks of various kinds, being able to access different kinds of intelligence in different states, and being able to operate a little bit outside the existing cultures and identity blocks of the world. And to me, that seems very much like what I imagined the ancient shamanic tradition to be. And I think this can be done in any of the traditions or non-traditions, but I think something like that, that's very embodiment oriented, very ecology oriented spirituality, has to sort of take a privileged place in any of the wisdom attempts that we're going to try to bring forward under these conditions.
Yeah, and I would agree with you that most of those principles can be found in most of the traditions. It seems like you're suggesting that the shamanic tradition has more of a somatic and ecological emphasis?
I think so, in the way we tend to think about it, which is to say, I think you could say that shamanism is a current running through all of the wisdom traditions throughout history, and that sometimes we lean a little more toward the somatic and the ecological, and sometimes we don't. And that there have been times where the institutions and transmission and teachings around wisdom haven't been so ecological and embodiment oriented, where they've done that kind of axial age movement away from flesh, away from embodiment. And that right now, that's a very dangerous approach, because most of our problems seem to be in a kind of mismatch between our more subtle and abstract and transcendental attempts and the actual world that we're trying to inhabit and co-build together. So what I would like to do is put those qualities, whether we call them shamanic or not, those somatic, multi-state, ecological qualities, to put them at the center of wisdom efforts going forward.
Yeah, fair enough. And certainly the shamanism traditionally was a tribal tradition, and it morphed into specialists like physicians and sorcerers, etc., as people moved out of tribal conditions. So I think yes, the tribal cultures were certainly more ecologically oriented. Their livelihood was dependent on. And I think you're right that with the axial age and the birth of the great traditions, there was a movement of, particularly in India, let's get the hell out of here. And not so in others like China. And Houston Smith, the great religious scholar, discerned a wonderful distinction between three great cultural traditions. He said that the West specialized in mastering the outer world, India turned inward and mastered the inner world, and China focused on the social world. And this is a time when we really need both. And we've had people in the integral world. I think of Terry Patton, for example, with his emphasis on the I, the we, and the it, as Ken Wilber distinguished. And yes, I think you're right. We need all of them, and maybe to point out that in the traditions that the great traditions that initially said, let's get the hell out of here, nirvana separate from samsara, there was in a number of them a turn backward to a non-dual embrace, particularly in the tantric traditions. And it seems like perhaps to shamanism, we should add some of the tantric traditions with their embrace of the world and matter and the body and love of those, even as traditions which have something to teach us about this kind of the approach you're suggesting.
Yeah, I think the shamanic and the tantric and the Taoist and a number of other systems might group together to epitomize that for us, even though you can find these flavors throughout many different traditions and approaches. So maybe before we move on from shamanism, one thing I would note, because I spend most of my time exploring inner practices, things that I do with my sensing, with my attention. So I'm not a big user of psychedelics, but I am a big advocate for psychedelics because it's not clear to me that people doing intentional inner practices is something that enough people can do fast enough to create the changes at the scale and tempo of the emerging crisis. This is a very open question for me because I'm fine-tuning and advocating inner practices. And to me, inner practices are at the root of the skill set that is productive of wisdom, which is what we need. But at the same time, is there any way to do it faster for many people? And it might be that reasonably well-organized psychedelic experiences, which is another shamanic aspect, might be one of those ways to accelerate this forward, at least to get people through those first couple of steps when we're facing a situation that is racing ahead so fast that the tempo of old wisdom traditions might not exactly be able to keep up with it.
Yeah. Really important points there, Layman. One, of course, is that underlying this is the fact that technology increases exponentially, and moral and spiritual development, psychological maturation increase linearly at best. And at best is framed in a question mark, because we need to acknowledge, and maybe we want to get into this at some stage, that under threat, most people tend to regress psychologically. And we are asking people to open to enormous existential threats and face them. So we better know how people respond. And maybe that's a topic we'll come back to. But for now, to your very important point of really, how do we accelerate and scale psychological growth and well-being and maturation? It's really one of the great issues of our time. Traditionally, as you're implying, these were, individual practices done by a small minority of the population, often as sequestered monks or nuns. And yet we need an enormous acceleration of our capacities of all kinds, not the technological we've got handled. That's accelerating faster than we can handle. But how do we accelerate and scale moral maturation, psychological capacities, wisdom, the virtues, all these qualities that we so now desperately need? And I think, maybe we'll want to spend some time just inventorying some of the wide range of possibilities, one of which is psychedelics. I have some hesitation about those. This has been an interest of mine for like a number of us for many years. And clearly they have enormous potentials. They can open heaven and hell and, in ways that are quite extraordinary. And there are some people who should not be using them. So it's a tricky business. Like you, I would like to see them available for those people who can benefit from them under the right circumstances, at the right time, with the right support, etc. And I think that could be very valuable. But I've spent years working on psychiatric wards and seeing a lot of people who should not be using these things. So it's a tricky one to handle briefly. But in general, yes, how do we use them and all the other tools in our psychological spiritual armamentarium to foster the very capacities we need?
One of the things that leaping off from psychedelics, because there's a lot of different ways to go through psychedelic experience, it seems, and some are traumatic and some are liberating, but very many of them are peculiar, that there's a certain kind of mythic strangeness that returns to the world for people, particularly using plant entheogens. And it seems to me that that's one of many ways that we might be able to prepare for a world that's going to feel very strange to us. Because in addition to all of the external accelerating convergent crises, there's a sense that the world is only half believable. Everything is peculiar. And it might be a function of our communication technologies. It might be a function of the way time operates. We don't really know where it's coming from, but it's hard to turn on the news without being confronted by an unbelievableness, a strangeness, an absurdity, right? That Trump becomes president, that deep fakes exist. You can't trust images and videos anymore, that machines are now seeming to think and talk back to us. And every day there's this cavalcade of peculiarity that our inherited instincts don't necessarily prepare us for. And if we lean just to the left, that might be overwhelming. It might be like a trauma that puts us into a defensive crouch. But if we can lean to the right, we might be able to surf the waves of strangeness that are kind of the implicit aesthetic of the meta crisis. So that's of concern to me, is to help people recognize and appreciate and try to work with a deep strangeness that I think is going to permeate the next period of time on this planet.
That's very interesting. I hadn't thought of that, Layman, and I appreciate that. Do you have suggestions for how to help people with that? Because clearly you're right. We did not grow up on our species grew up on the savannas of Africa, not in these megapolises and with exploding technology and all the other things you mentioned. So yes, there's a ongoing weirdness and novelty, a kind of future shock that we all face each day. And yeah, so, and it does require, ideally, we would all be cultivating the qualities of, say, equanimity and calm, which are key contemplative skills, in which these novel and strange experiences would arise and be reflected on, learned from. But that's not where most of us are. So how do you suggest working with strangeness, the future shock?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for simply naming it so that it's there as one of the cognitive objects we can detect. That gives us the opportunity to begin to work with it.
Good point. Yeah.
I think there's a physiological component, when we think of the 20th century stereotype of the surfer. There's a kind of physiological looseness that enables you to move with waves that might otherwise seem too complex and intimidating. I think there's an appreciation that can come sometimes through psychedelics, but I think more often than not through certain kinds of therapy and certain kinds of art. Because I think these sort of surrealistic exploration of the unconscious allows us to have an intimate, familiar encounter with the peculiar and the strange, the odd juxtapositions, which are accompanied by this feeling of the strange, of the absurd. And I think if we're a little bit more familiar with it in ourselves, then we might be able to work with it better in the world around us.
Yeah, that makes sense, because in several ways, I'm just thinking, anyone who takes up a meditation practice is shocked at the panoply of experiences of all kinds, many of which initially seem rather weird and can initially seem somewhat overwhelming. But gradually one recognizes the mind is infinitely creative. One develops a little more stability and equanimity and calm in the face of the ever-changing array of experiences that arise. And yes, that makes sense that would be a ground for dealing with the increasing strangeness of our world. You also mentioned the kind of flow, the surfer as a metaphor of adaptation. It's interestingly, the chair of philosophy at my university, the University of California at Irvine, is a surfer. And that's one of the reasons he's at Irvine. And he wrote a book, Surfing with Sartre. And one of his key ideas is this adaptive attunement to the waves and the ever-changing flow of the wave and of life. And so adaptive attunement, it feels like something that's you're pointing to and we're going to require as we hopefully learn to adapt to what's happening and adapt our ways so that we can change what's happening.
Another element that is coming up for me, which is it's similar to the people who can't adapt to the strangeness, right? There's a sense of that it can act like a distress, act like a trauma of some kind. And one of the signs in the culture of this kind of distress is that we tend to polarize into two large groups around every topic and then demonize each other and not get very good solutions. And we saw this recently with COVID, for example. It broke the population in half, and they couldn't understand each other, and they began to collectively function at a lower level. And there's a question about what do people require in order not to get so sucked into these fairly well-studied and anticipatable dualistic mass formations that we've seen throughout history. And one of the things is, I think, clarity about what our needs are, which has to do with psychological and meditative and biological understandings of what we actually require in order to be stable beings, right? So that people who went through COVID, no matter what side they were on, or any of the other crises, if they have a good meditation practice, if they have a good relationship practice, if they know what they should be eating, if they were getting exercise, if they were getting into nature, if they knew how much of the right kind of socializing or sexualizing was necessary for them to be settled beings, then they would have been in a much better position. But I think a lot of people are adapted to lifestyles and habit structures that don't actually meet any of their needs, and that they don't enter into inquiry about what their needs actually are, partly because they've assimilated foreign ideas about what their needs are from the culture, partly because it's embarrassing to think you have needs, partly because needs and neediness might seem like the opposite of the transcendental efforts you're undertaking. But I think there's a real there's a real necessity to clarify our needs in order to have a good foundation if the waves are going to be choppy going forward.
Yeah, and of course we are not only easily blind to our own motives and needs, but of course we are now assaulted with multi-billion-dollar industries trying to inculcate artificial needs into us. And we're also being manipulated by social media to be sparked or antagonized so as to spend as much time on these media as possible and give them as much time and money, the so-called attention economy. So it's not a small thing for these many reasons to tune into what we really want. And it sounds so simple, of course, but as so many things do, like just pay attention to your breath. Oh, that sounds easy. Until I tried. So also becoming aware of what we most deeply want is, I would agree with you, a terribly important practice. And I emphasize practice because it's a skill, and that we are by nature, by our nature of our conditioning and who knows what, plus the additional challenges I've mentioned, we are distracted from and defended against the recognition of our deepest desires in significant part because the vast majority of people, and I don't know to what extent this is part of our genetic makeup or what extent it's cultural, but the reality is the vast majority of people are terrified of their own minds and scared that if they really turn attention inside, they'll find this dungeon of darkness and demonic forces and negativity and destructive elements and demons of various kinds. And so most people live their lives trying to deny and distract themselves from their own inner world. And it's that, and you can look across psychotherapies and contemplative practices, and those together, those constitute the vast majority of inner technologies we have. You can look at all of them as helping us to rehabilitate our ability to experience, to be able to get past the defenses we have against opening to our own inner experience, and to coming to the recognition that at the deepest levels, our minds are not something we have to fear. They are these incredible resources, and we have depths of inner wisdom and compassion and capacities and love that we haven't dared to imagine. We're not only more than we think, we're more than we can think. And to recognize that when the mind is simply held in open awareness, then the mind turns out to be self-healing, self-correcting, self-actualizing, and self-transcending. And that's one of the greatest gifts I think a human being can make, is to discover that we don't have to fear our inner world, our psyches, that they are these cornucopias available to us. And that what we most want turns out to be not something destructive or demonic or egocentric, but something very profound. It really turns it out to be a profound, all-embracing care, as you implied with Heidegger.
Among the very basic wisdom skills are, like you were just saying, an attitudinal skill to presume, partly as an act of faith and partly based on experience, that disquieting inner phenomenon represent a portal to deep riches and abundance. And that goes along with a certain kind of metacognitive skill of holding a particular balance between differentiation and embrace. because those inner contents, in order to be worked with and moved through, have to be accepted, but not totally identified with. And then that becomes a general skill that is applied to the world as well. And I thought about that skill when you mentioned media a little bit earlier, because even if there were none of the other crisis factors, which are objectively there, but even if they weren't, our information tools, our media would still want us to feel that crisis was there, because that creates these addictive loops. And so we have to be looking at how these wisdom skills are applied in the moment of the use of our information media. Right. So that's something I face with the kids a lot, which is how do you create the right gap and the right embrace, the correct balance of feeling attention in the moment of using content, because you can't simply accept what they're saying to you, that anything now, as we know increasingly, could be fake, could be distorted, is incentivized to create a result. At the same time, if you don't take it somewhat seriously, you don't know how to respond to it or to glean any knowledge from it. So getting that balance right, and somatic awareness is a part of that, not losing our sense of the body when we're engaged with these tools. But to me, it's really important just to be present as a citizen in the new information environment, to have something like the wisdom skill of appropriate, negotiable relational distancing between consciousness and its contents.
Yeah. Yeah, and an increasingly demanded skill, as you say, the challenge of the information explosion and information dysfunctions and information disinformation that we're facing is growing. And clearly, this is a core feature of both, a core challenge of both contemporary life, for those of us fortunate enough to, have access to all these technologies, and also now a core element of the meta crisis. That in some way these information dysfunctions are now upstream from a lot of the dysfunctions in the world, and we're going to have to figure out ways of handling the information disasters and disinformation, and the challenge to making sense of anything, if we're going to be able to navigate through the contemporary crisis. And of course, the challenge, one of the things that's not mentioned often is that these are probably going to be issues for as long as civilization is with us, because we've unleashed these genies, and there are going to be a lot of other genies down the line, so that henceforth, to maintain a civilization and society is going to require an ongoing capacity and skill for working with these challenges and emerging challenges and challenges we haven't even conceived of yet, in a way that former eras just never had to deal with.
One of the things that seems to me to be common to all of the wisdom development traditions, and is essential to dealing with the way we react to and process information today, is the effect that intentionality has on our psyche, on our brain, on our physiology. Because one of the questions I often ask myself is, like, what distinguishes education from wisdom development, right? Where is knowledge gain and skill development separated from something that looks very similar, but unfolds as a wisdom trajectory? And often one of the key elements is something like intentionality, particularly intentionality in terms of where you place your attention. I actually thought of an example flooded into my mind, because I think might have been the original Iron Man movie. I was in the theater, and the theater is such a nice circumstance, because it's like being in the temple. You're sitting still in the dark for 2 hours. Great opportunity. And so I decided that I would keep the frame of the screen in my attention at all times during the film, which sometimes is easy and sometimes is a struggle. And when I walked out of the theater, I heard a church bell, and it hit me with that classic kind of utterly immersive Zen wave where you're in it, you're out of it, everything's solved all at once. I thought, was this the result simply of an extended period of applying an additional point of intention to my attending? So I think that, I mean, there's so much diversity in how that could be deployed, but I think any number of practices that ask people to bring intention to their interactions with media can generate a metacognitive frame for them that allows them to be a participant who is not absorbed into the story that the system is selling them, which in turn is a requirement for them to be able to show up facing the meta crisis.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought intention into the discussion, Layman, and it's such a key quality and capacity, and so much turns on it. Our lives really follow our intentions, and to hone and, in traditional terms, purify one's intentions, to make them a little less egocentric, a little more altruistic, to move them up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, to imbue them with love and compassion, etc. That is a lifelong practice, and it's so important. I mean, our intentions literally direct our lives. They're the compass for our lives, and intentions merge with aspirations, and aspirations are, the two. You can think of, they're very similar in a way, but they really are the compasses which direct our lives. And as we intend, so we become, and so our lives become. And I think it's hard to overestimate the importance of intention in so many things. So many situations people ask, well, is this good or bad? Or, you raised psychedelics. Were psychedelics helpful or not helpful? So much depends on the intention with which you use them. You can go out to a party and have a nice time, or you can use them for tantric eroticism of very profound kinds, or you can use them for awakening. And as the intent, with psychedelics, you'll see what you intend, the mind will create. And you begin to get an appreciation of the power of intention, and the creative capacities of the mind seem to be virtually unlimited, if not infinite. And what is created is a function of what's intended. And so becoming aware of one's intention is a practice unto itself, which is an essential element of the refining of the intention. So I'm glad you brought that up, and there's so much more we could say, and maybe we will.
I think another, for me, very basic skill set in terms of turning experience and education toward a wisdom direction, which ends up being a direction that can respond to the metacrisis, is the awareness of multiple types of intelligence within ourselves, right? So in the integral model, there are these lines of development. In a lot of spiritual traditions, there's a very basic sense of heart, mind, and body, or at least mind and body. The sense that we can check different aspects of ourselves that process the world distinctly in their own qualitative way, and that these sources can combine to create both experiential senses of intense harmony, but also increased intelligence about the world we live in because we checked and cross-checked multiple sources. It seems to me that one of the deficiencies of most of our education is that it's not trying to instruct at least heart, mind, and body at the same time. As a result, we don't know how to think about, feel about, and sense and act in the condition of the metacrisis. Many of us can just feel it and don't know what to do. Some people are taking action, but they don't know how to think about it. There's a real imbalance between these internal functions because they're shared capacity isn't being preferenced or privileged in our education systems.
Yes, tragically so. And this raises the whole question of education. And as Zach Stein, who is one of the great thinkers in the integral world, would say, if you don't see, if education isn't the answer to whatever you're asking, you probably got the wrong answer. Yeah. So whether we think of education as individual or collective, and whether we think of it as formal, informal, but let's stick with the more formal education systems. Basically, educational systems are primarily oriented towards the intellect, and they're primarily, particularly at this time in our Western culture, oriented towards making a living rather than making a life. So that raises challenges because, as you're implying or pointing to very strongly, we need human beings who are whole human beings who have cultivated multiple intelligences and capacities, who have developed the heart as much as the head, or embodied, who have a rich emotional life, etc., have access to their emotions, and have the capacities for working for accessing and working with their own psyches. Now, that indeed would be a wisdom education, and yet our educational system is, to repeat, oriented towards the intellect and oriented primarily towards getting a trade. And so, given the capacities we need and that you've emphasized during our discussion to heal and work with and deal with the meta crisis, yes, educational transformation is key. And it's clearly, we can see pockets of this. We can definitely see that there are various places where, for example, kids even in kindergarten are being introduced to the emotion toolbox as one particular set of little educational tricks that they're being introduced to, and a variety of other skills. So it's beginning, but one of the questions, and to get back to one of the questions you raised, is how do we scale and accelerate this education transformation, and how do we accelerate our capacity and what we know about fostering these developmental skills? Now, I'm sure there are many ways that this can be done. For example, anyone who's done meditation recognizes that, we spend the vast majority of our time for the first few years in meditation lost in thoughts and fantasies. Now, if we had a technology, and I bet it'll be available in the next decade, which would give us a biofeedback or neurofeedback signal each time attention wandered off into thought or fantasy, I would think that would be the biggest advance in contemplative technology since the advent of Tantra 1,800 years ago. I think it would accelerate contemplative development and maturation in ways we can't even comprehend yet. And I imagine that is only the first of a variety of tools which will come online. Now, this is when I say technological tools to enhance access to altered states, transcendent states, capacities, skills, maturation, it's not entirely new because we already have some of those. In fact, you mentioned one of them, psychedelics. Another one is some, in just beginning ways, some of the main mind-brain machines we have. Two others are mind-blowing. Who would have ever thought? One is resuscitation technology. We now have millions of people who've had near-death experiences and had profound openings through their near-death experience. We may not know what a near-death experience is, but one thing the research makes clear is we sure know that the people who have them come back radically transformed, and they come back radically transformed in two ways. Their lives tend to center more around love and learning. Those are the two big values that they come back with, or love and self-actualization. And the fourth technology, which is kind of mind-blowing in its impact it's had, the so-called overview effect, the effect that astronauts get when they look back on the Earth and look at this tiny little pearl in the infinity of black space, and that this life on this precious little globe is so fragile. And they come to a realization of so many of them have come back and with a desire to bring that recognition of the experience they had to the world, and to have its implications recognized. And William Shatner just went into orbit, I think a week ago, and came back bubbling about, we've got to protect the world, we've got to protect the world. And Shatner, who did he play? Star Trek, Captain Kirk or something? So it was fascinating. He came back on he was a 90. He got into space at last. and came back bubbling about the beauty of the Earth and the need to protect it. So there may be ways, technological ways, we can accelerate and scale psychological maturation and well-being. There may also be didactic ways. For example, I think like you, I've spent years exploring the world's spiritual traditions. And I've come to think that the Tibetans have the world's most sophisticated spiritual technology and the world's worst pedagogy. They tend to be abysmal at teaching. Well, of course, there are exceptions. I'm overgeneralizing, of course. But there's an imbalance between the profound wisdom they have to impart and the pedagogical skills with which it's usually transmitted or failingly transmitted. So just learning how to educate and transmit the wisdom and skills and practices that we already have in this vast reservoir and cornucopia of the world's spiritual traditions. We've been discussing now for almost an hour. It's interesting how we've gravitated from our focus on the meta crisis to a recognition of how crucial it is to foster the psychological and spiritual capacities in each and every one of us, or at least in as many people as possible, if we are to address and help and heal with these issues. And it keeps coming back to how do we do this? And one way of looking at it is, well, we really need the classic virtues, an old 2,000-year-old qualities of heart and mind that have been emphasized for 2,000 plus years. And if you look in, say, Western psychology textbooks about, say, wisdom or love, etc., the general theme is these are wonderful qualities. Too bad we don't know how to develop them. And then you open a spiritual text, and it's like, here are 50 practices for cultivating love or compassion, or here are 20 for cultivating wisdom. And it's like, we need translators. We need people who can, we need more than translators. We need what Carl Jung called Gnostic intermediaries. We need people who can imbibe the wisdom in these ancient contemplative traditions into themselves so deeply that it becomes part of themselves, who can learn the language and concepts of the communities that they're wanting to communicate to, and who can translate the wisdom of the traditions into the language and concepts in such a way that it goes, oh, aha, of course, how obvious. They can explain, translate, and legitimate the ideas and wisdom there. And that in itself is a skill. We need more Gnostic intermediaries, because to be a Gnostic intermediary is a profound skill. And here we have this incredible reservoir of practices that we've been emphasizing how much we need, going, just not appreciated by the vast, or even accessible to the vast majority of people. So, okay.
Well, that was a ton of good stuff. I guess the shamanic aspect of my character would want to emphasize that something similar to the overview effect actually happens to people in wilderness immersion experiences, like that deep in nature. People can have very similar responses. I'm
Good
like you,
point.
I'm very intrigued by the possibility of tools like neurofeedback to dramatically accelerate at least the initial capacities for a high level intentional modification of the psyche. When it comes to pedagogy and education, I think there's a really interesting question, which is how much of it is it about providing, and how much is it about protecting? Because we could say, where are the Gnostic intermediaries, and we should be cultivating them, networking, and empowering them. And providing access to techniques, providing access to literature, providing access to spaces and new kinds of educational projects. On the other hand, that takes place within a system that might have built-in perverse incentives to prevent that from occurring, right? That if it was protected from those incentives, it might, to some degree, spontaneously organize itself in developmental directions. We face a system where the education is not just to help the individual intellectually prepare for livelihood, it's also to prepare that individual to be useful to the existing power structure. And I think one of the really uninspected problems in developmental psychology is the degree to which modern systems don't want to regenerate modern people. They would like to regenerate pre-modern people who will believe the advertising, believe the political propaganda, vote when appropriate, obey the symbolic infrastructure of the system rather than think too much as a rational individual, but take on the symbolic identity of being modern. So there may be, and this is what sort of radical politics has been pointing at for 100 or 200 years, or as long as we've had that, is that there's something in the dominant socio-political order that works against people's attempts to set up these new kinds of systems, because a virtuous individual is not necessarily a individual whose behavior will be friendly to the existing power structure.
Yeah, very good points. There's a lot in what you said, and we have several threads that it would be good to follow. So, starting with your most recent one, the idea that radical politics is recognized, radical psychiatry, a number of things have recognized that what is required of us is to be able to step outside the conventional frame of thinking and to question for ourselves, and then to question collectively, to look anew for our deepest priorities and values and what really serves, rather than what seems to serve or is fed up to us through the conventional mores and myths and values and belief systems. So what you're talking to, and here we have now the advantage of adult developmental psychology, the recognition that psychological development can continue not only through the conventional stages that have long been recognized, but into several post-conventional stages that we've only just begun to recognize, and that Ken Wilber and other integralists have mapped out for us in beautiful ways. And what you're pointing to is the need for maturation to post-conventional stages, and yet you emphasize the fact that conventional institutions and structures and culture tend to perpetuate themselves and find post-conventional questioning sometimes quite threatening, because at, for example, the moral developmental stage, the conventional moral developmental stage is often called maintaining norms. And at the conventional moral stage, one feels a virtue in identifying with and fostering and maintaining the conventional norms of my country above all, et cetera, et cetera. So the post-conventional thinking, which has at its heart the stepping back, the reflection on and questioning of the very beliefs and myths, et cetera, that we've been given, that is perceived as threatening. So So Ken Wilber has pointed out culture acts like a magnet. It pulls people up to the conventional level, but tends to retard development beyond it. And those people who have matured to not only post-conventional but trans-conventional levels, think Socrates and Jesus have been at risk of ending up on funeral pyres or crucifixes. So it's not a small thing to go beyond and question the conventional norms. And again, what this implies is that one can simply question them by challenging and threatening people, but to do it effectively requires, again, becoming a Gnostic intermediary, though this time a vertical Gnostic intermediary, translating not across cultures, but across levels. And to do that skillfully, I think that's an art that we'll probably be learning for the rest of our lives. As far as I can see, so much depends on it. Well, let me back up and say in Buddhism, there are two kinds of wisdom. There's prajna, which is deep insight into the fundamental nature of experience and reality. And there's upaya, which is skillful means. That is teaching and helping most effectively and most skillfully. And those are two different kinds of wisdom. And they're recognized also in the West. There's Sophia and Phronesis. So both capacities are required, and both are skills, and both require development. So I agree with you completely on the importance of this, and how fortunate we now have the developmental framework to make sense of this in an entirely new and extremely valuable way. And I'm going to stop my screed in a moment, but I want to make sure we don't lose and maybe come back to something you started on. You pointed to the importance of nature as a medium and environment for fostering virtues and wisdom in particular. I think at some stage we were exploring the question, what do we know about how to cultivate wisdom and virtues in general? So, but enough, over to you.
Yeah, it strikes me that between those two kinds of wisdom, between Sophia and Phronesis, social and emotional intelligence plays a tremendous mediating role. That if people mentally arrive at a position where they have a post-conventional critique of the social norms and understand that to be virtuous somehow, if they can't remain calm most of the time, feel pretty good, empathize with others, then they end up polarizing people against them with their constant attacks, their demands that everyone wake up from their illusions, and that puts them responsively into a defensive crouch. There's a necessity to be able to regulate yourself emotionally and to be able to socially interact with others in a way that's useful to them, but also decreases the odds that you will be inhibited by the conventional structure around you so that you can continue to grow in that direction. And so that's partly skillful means, and it's partly direct insight into the structure of things, right? To approach both of those in a very heartfelt and largely heart coherent manner seems to be essential. Maybe I'll leave that there, but I think we should come back to the role of nature.
Yeah, and I would agree. And we have, Schmachtenberger, Daniel Schmachtenberger. Mm-hmm. There's so many brilliant contributions to thinking about the meta crisis and how we need to respond. And he points out that if when you're trying to make a contribution, if you're not thinking about the consequences of not only your contribution but how you're making it, you are probably going to be very unskillful. And we've had a lot of examples of this over the last few years with the polarization of this country and other countries. We've had these far right, painful demonstrations, and some people racists, etc. And we've also had extreme progressives, with many of whom values, probably pretty good, pretty valuable insights. But played out in ways which have just fed into, for example, the most have just exacerbated the problems rather than made them better. Rioting in the streets, destruction of property. Well, that usually doesn't help. And it usually just gets people more and more defensive, as you just pointed out. So, yes, having the emotional, social intelligence to look at, and here we get back to your point about intention, Layman. Am I venting, or am I merely venting, or am I really going to doing something which will make a contribution?
Coming back to nature, one of the things that stands out to me when I think about the emergence of human wisdom traditions on this planet is that most of it took place prehistorically. We don't have records about that, but if we've been anatomically modern for 200,000 years or so, then presumably most of our Dharma activity took place during that period of time. Not only before we had written records, but before we had buildings, that most of it took place in a deeply naturally embedded context. And that when people go to the park or the lake for recreation, that there's a deeply spiritual transformational drive to that doesn't seem to be elaborated and sophisticated and intentional enough to get them where they want to go. But something in that, I think, speaks to a deeply adapted sensibility within us that nature and interactions with nature of a particular kind are a fundamental source of the production of wisdom in our species.
Sounds entirely right, and I think a vast number of sages would agree with you. Certainly, one of the core recommendations in many traditions is retreat in nature and take periods for solitude and reflection in nature. And even in contemporary psychology and biology, we have the idea that we are biophilic, that we are inherently oriented towards natural settings and life. And the whole field of environmental psychology is finding that that there's validity to this. When we spend time in nature, people tend to become calmer, more reflective. Their daily foolishness and the stuff that occupies our minds most of the time tends to drop away. And so we have this information exactly supporting what you're saying, that being in nature can be very supportive to cultivating wisdom and other virtues. And we are conducting an unprecedented social global experiment of unprecedented nature and proportions, in which we live. The vast majority of the human population now lives the vast majority of the time indoors under artificial lighting schedules and artificial lighting spectrums, and with sounds which are quite unusual, mechanical for the most part, and staring at screens. The average teenager, 13 to 18 in this country, spends 7 hours in front of a screen. That's extraordinary. What's that doing to us? Well, a lot of things, and it's an experiment. We're still finding out what it's doing to us. And particularly when you couple that amount of time in front of screens with the fact that there are billion-dollar industries trying to manipulate us using all sorts of very sophisticated AI to keep us in front of those screens. So contrast what's happening with our contemporary lifestyles and the effects environmental psychology is showing it's having on us, but it's still, we have a lot to learn. Contrast that with what ancient traditions and contemporary psychology is now beginning to say about the benefits of being in nature. And yeah, you're right. And that leads to questions such as, how do we How do we orient our lives to have more time in nature? How do we assist other people in having more time in nature? How do we preserve nature, not only for the fact that it'd be nice to have a functioning planet, but also it would be nice to have people with access to it for their own individual and collective sanity. And so this is an enormously important question, or questions.
It occurs to me to want to tease apart the notion of nature, which is a little bit ambiguous, because we don't mean every kind of nature, right? We don't want to die screaming in the void of outer space, even though that's nature. But that doesn't have the restorative effects we're thinking about. We're thinking about something more specific than that. We're thinking about, this is one of the language games I play, is I tend to divide nature from natural. That natural to me is a kind of balance between the human and nature. Where we preference certain organizational patterns and try to regenerate them. And if it goes too much in either direction, it's not great for the system. So there's something about naturalness, which is restorative, which we can have a hand in creating, which allows us to modify nature slightly and be modified by nature in return. And in very simple conditions of human living, anciently, that balance might have naturally, so to speak, been very appropriate. Now we have tremendous technological capacity, and we would have to do much more thoughtful attempts to reestablish that balance. I think we see that in certain places. I think we see it in science, the attempt to import into our minds the patterns of nature that we're discovering. We see it in fields like biomimicry, where we think, oh, here's how nature solved that problem. Maybe we can build a building or a molecule that resembles the way this got solved. We're seeing it in medicine. People can be sent for forest bathing. But there's a lot of different ways to think about how to reset that balance, how to make the techno-social domain more reflective of the patterning styles that we see in nature that we like and find restorative and find to be catalysts for our ongoing development. And I think, to me, that's a sensibility that can bring many different domains of knowledge together in front of the meta-crisis, because one of the hugest aspects of the meta-crisis is a kind of turbulence and tearing apart of the human-natural relationship. I think we could be much more intentional about bringing that back together. And I think we see versions of that spread across all of the knowledge domains. And it might be worth clarifying that and bringing that together within a single concept. Like, if we could get the human nature balance right, that might go a long way to ameliorating the crises we're looking at.
Yeah, good point. And clearly, when people spend more time in nature, they have greater appreciation for it. And that is something we definitely need at this time. And yes, balance seems to be a magic word. I remember the first retreat I ever went on, Ramdas, who was, was a big figure in the spiritual world, and until his death a few years ago, said balance is a magical word on the spiritual path, and I think he's right. And so finding that balance between natural settings and the demands and joys of the technological comforts and capacities we now have. And I just want to add one caveat that came to mind as you were talking. You mentioned something about, technological nature combination, and there's research now on the fact that the healing capacity of nature in people in hospitals. And after surgery, those patients who have a room with a window looking out onto a natural setting heal faster, need less pain meds, and get out of hospital more quickly than those who don't. But it doesn't work if you put up a television screen of natural settings. So it has to be the real thing.
There's degrees of approximation of those patterns in a multidimensional way. Like, you could have a plastic Christmas tree. Visually, it looks like natural patterns. So that's already good, but you also need it to smell right. You also needed to put off the right bioelectricity. You also need to get, so we have to get much better at approximating natural patterns in the technosocial domain across multiple different dimensions. we originally framed this as 90 minutes. I would be happy to go another half hour, but I want to check with you about how you are with time.
Oh, well, this is such a such a stimulating discussion, which I assumed it would be. So I'm happy to keep going.
Okay, well, let's try another half hour. Yeah, all of this is, I've come back again and again to the word shamanic, which is just a signifier I use to point to some of these flavors in addressing the meta crisis, because it seems like the noosphere and the biosphere have to figure out a way to work together much better, right? And that's not, there's a way to do that in a developmental sense. There's an incorrect way, so to speak, which is to regress from the noosphere to the biosphere, right? To think that primitive shamanism is the solution. But there's another attempt to make a trans-noospheric biosphere, to have a humanly meaningful relationship with the environment. And how do we set that up? Because even if we don't blow ourselves up, and even if we don't generate a diabolical artificial intelligence, we're still going to face this problem of destabilizing our climate, massive biodiversity die-offs, widespread pollution, a real toxic relationship between our species and its ecosystem. So what is it that we can do that might resemble wisdom cultivation in the individual that the species could do to improve that relationship? And some of that's going to be directly technological. So one of the first things that comes to my mind is feedback devices, right? That the more we know about what's happening in real time to the environment, the more we're able to start to grow into a sense of responsibility for it. If we seeing the ice caps melting, we're seeing the change in the salinity levels of the oceans, we're seeing that. That's really a powerful tool. Whether it will help us in time, I don't know, but I think we have to go down the pathway of being wise custodians of the environment, and that requires a direct feedback that's somehow analogous to mindfulness within the individual.
Yes, so that seems like a key element, having accurate information and having it presented ideally in the ways you're suggesting, in quite graphic forms that make it clearly apparent, not just as some figures on a graph, but as pictures, for example, of icebergs melting or receding or any number of other things. So that feels one crucial element. And I'm just thinking about what else do we need? What else are we going to be called for? In you spoke of the quadrants, in all four quadrants. I mean, we could, between us, I'm sure, come up with quite a list of things that would cultivate individual wisdom and hopefully thereby would spread out into the culture. But I'm wondering if you have any other thoughts on what we need as kind of prerequisites, in addition to measures and information about what's actually going on, to get us started more effectively down this road.
You know, when we look at that quadrant map, I think the top two zones are the easiest ones for us to think about, because we have a lot of access to our own inner experience, and we have a lot of profound wisdom teachings that we inherit about what the individual can do. Also, we're very familiar with practical realities of life. We understand that if you can't eat, then suddenly it doesn't matter that there's a climate crisis. You need to be secured. You need to have a fit body and a functional mind. You need to have the nutrients you need. You need to not have your house burning down. These things in the upper right, so to speak, are essential. And that's very visceral. Everyone gets that part. When it comes to the lower two quadrants, the starting place is much more ambiguous. We're not quite sure how we begin to collectively build a shared meaning, and we're not quite sure how to implement more advanced patterns of interaction. We're aware that there's different kinds of political proposals. We're aware that there's a lot of new work on algorithms. We're aware there should be voting reform. There should be changes to the procedures we use to interact as a polity, as a business. but we haven't seen them tested very well. We don't have an intuition for it, so that's very difficult. So in that domain, in the lower right, so to speak, just getting people into discussion about collective intelligence procedures and getting them to experiment with different ways of doing sense making, coming to collective decisions, I think that's hugely important, because one of our problems is show of hands majority voting is the best thing we've come up with so far. And it's got its limitations. It's better than a dictatorship, but it's not perfect by a long shot. There are many richer ways to do collective decision making, and we're not getting any experience with them. So starting in small groups, maybe in the family, maybe in cities, experimentally attempting new collective intelligence protocols, new voting styles, new management styles. I think that's really important to get the data. When it comes to the lower left, I think we exaggerate the role that narrative plays. It doesn't play no role, but my concern is that priests and authors and literate people always think a story is necessary in order to do collective meaning making. They're not wrong, but that's only a part of the solution. I think people need to mix with types of people they're not used to. They need to have common efforts and common pleasures. I think we saw that in North America during the Second World War, that one of the things we did were take people out of their normal lives and put them to work together in a common challenge. And that there was a wave of kind of positive developmental shared attitude in America following that war, partly because they were victorious and partly because they eliminated their economic rivals, but partly because their people circulated more. And I think it's essential for people to mix with and try to actually do tasks with other types of people than they normally associate with, if we want to generate a shared mutual sentiment that can look toward greater challenges that are menacing all of us. I don't know if that answered your question, but those are the areas I look to.
Yeah, well, you're pointing to some of the many, possibly boundless number of shifts we're going to have to make in culture and community and institutions and politics, etc., as part of the ongoing evolution of our ways of living and ways of living more ecologically and sustainably. And we should emphasize, and it's been implicit in our conversation, that this is going to be with us for as long as our civilization and societies hold together. We've reached a place where our technology is so powerful, as we acknowledged, and it looks like it's probably going to get more powerful, that this kind of reflective, longer, bigger picture perspective is going to be essential just to keeping things going. Civilizations are enormously complex structures which require incredible effort and energy and ingenuity to create and maintain. And it's going to, we've kind of we've created it, but it hasn't been as yet. Now there's the shift towards the recognition of how much it's going to require of us to maintain it. And maybe we should put since we're talking big picture here, we probably should emphasize that in some ways, the meta crisis we're facing is part of a bigger picture and a recurring pattern. But Arnold Toynbee, the great historian, pointed out that all civilizations face challenges to their well-being and survival. And that what he is in his survey of the world's civilizations and history, what he found that those civilizations which survived and continued to thrive were not ones which didn't face challenges, because all civilizations face challenges. And by the way, it looks like the average lifespan of a civilization is only a few hundred years. So we're already going longer than others have, and We just need to be aware that civilizations die. Most civilizations have died. And so we don't come with any guarantee that we'll make it, but there's nothing to do except do the best we can. But Toynbee pointed out that those civilizations which have survived recurrent threats have done it through the emergence of what he called a creative minority, a group of people who recognized the threat, came up with an effective response, and then inspired the majority to first recognize and then adopt the skillful responses. So that's the stage we're now in with the meta-crisis. We have not one, but fortunately multiple creative minorities around the world and creative individuals who have recognized facets of the threat, because the sheer complexity of the meta-crisis is another order of complexity beyond anything we've faced before. No one person, no group even, fully comprehends the enormity and complexity and interactions of the challenges we're facing, but each of us has a part of the puzzle. And so there are multiple creative minorities that are emerging, all looking for how they can make their contribution. And in many cases, falling prey to what I call the single focus fallacy. And the single focus fallacy is a function of the tendency all of us have to think in terms of zero in on one thing, as opposed to holding the bigger picture you emphasized before, and moving into a systems thinking, which can look at multiple variables and interactions. But the single focus fallacy is to assume I think there are three major single focus fallacies. One of them is the single issue fallacy. Global warming is our big challenge, or capitalism, or ecological degradation, or pollution. And it's true, all those are challenges, but they're not the only ones, and they're interacting. Second is the single source fallacy, the idea that, well, it's all due to capitalism, or it's all due to greed, or it's all due to social media, or pick your favorite. All of which, again, are true, but only parts of the picture. And then there's the single solution fallacy. Well, we just have to recycle, or we just have to create laws that you can't pollute, etc. Well, yeah, we need all those, and we need a lot more. And so one of the challenges of contemporary creative minorities, which is a greater challenge than it has ever been before in history, is to step out of the single focus fallacies and to recognize the multiplicity of both the challenges and the thinking and the responses that are going to be necessary if we are to be the effective creative minorities that we're called to be in our contemporary times and in all future times, probably.
That's a very complex move for people to undergo, right? To embrace that multiplicity, and not just embrace it, but to emotionally be able to go through those different perspectives and angles on the situation and be able to come together in some kind of consolidation on the other side, or at least have the sense of confidence that that's a possibility for them. So we're dealing, like you say, with a minority of the population that has to lead on this, even though it's probable that the right kinds of supportive circumstances and pedagogy could make a lot more people available to these capacities. It still takes a while. It's still going to be difficult for people to get through this. One of the things that bubbled up for me is you mentioned Gnostic intermediaries before, who are bringing great wisdom and other states and appreciations of fundamental aspects of reality into human social circumstances in a way that allow people to adaptively move toward appreciating and integrating them more. But I think we also have a need now for, I might call them inter-Gnostic intermediaries, right? Because who can assemble and interlink and move between and provide a context for all of the different ways in which the Gnostic intermediaries and the meta-crisis responsive communities, how do we interlink all of them, right? There's all of these different approaches, there's all of these different hubs. as profound and as deep and as integrative as any of them are, they're going to have their limitations. There's only going to be so many of them, and they're going to have a particular mood or attitude or flavor. And we need to have a lot more of the cells that move between them, that make them co-functional with each other. And I think the challenge I'm often looking at is how do we get a lot more of those, and how do they teach each other what they need and what skills they need to emphasize, what supports they collectively need. How do we build this intermediary network between all of these different minorities so that they can function on their own, but that their functioning on their own still works fundamentally in collaboration with all the other attempts? What's the temperament and what are the practicalities needed to create a lot more of those intermediary cells?
Yeah, that's a nice idea, Layman, which I hadn't thought of, and thank you very much for that. It's the way I've somewhat humorously thought of something similar. How do we not only save the world, but save it from the people who want to save it in other ways than I want to save it? So yeah, how do we move between and support and integrate and catalyze these different groups most effectively and translate between them? And you've left me something to think about there. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's been a deficit of these people historically, because yes, we're a fifth of the way into the 21st century now. We're passing into some period of time that will be characterized by this meta crisis, but we're not the first ones to notice this. We have antecedents that go back 100, 200 years of people who are explicitly looking at the global frame, explicitly calling for wisdom, explicitly calling for social transformation, looking at the trends. We're facing them very directly, but people have been trying to set up new communities, new educational systems, new economic projects, new ways of dispersing wisdom cultivation for a while now. And why haven't these been more successful? As successful as they may have been, why haven't they taken a bigger hold in the world, right? Is it because there aren't enough of these intermediary cells? That's possible, right? Is it because they've been undermined by failures to do their own cleanup, their own shadow work? Is it because they haven't focused on protecting and resourcing each other well enough? There's a number of different ways to approach the problem, but I think that's a really important aspect of this, because if we're placing our hope in the collective efforts of these active leading edge minorities, we really want to know why previous leading edge minorities haven't already solved this. What do they still need? How do we help them do their work more effectively in the world?
Yeah, interesting point. And I guess that would be a very valuable use of historical studies to look at idealistic utopian communities and sanghas, etc., and ask, why were they successful to whatever degree they were, and why were they not less successful? And that's a very valuable area of study, which I hadn't thought of. So thank you. Yeah, and these are going to be ongoing questions for us. And again, they're ongoing wisdom questions, and it's interesting. We keep coming back to, understandably and appropriately, the large-scale collective movements and innovations that we're going to require to deal with the meta crisis. And yet, when we look at initiating these things, it always comes back, if you do enough thinking, to what can I do? Yes, they should do this and they should do that. It's like, well, they should, but what can I actually do? And that's another wisdom question. So it's a question that is really worthy of time and reflection. And it doesn't have a one-time answer. And the more we ask it, the more deeply it will take us into the question, the more it will unveil more appropriate answers. And even deeper than the wisdom question, what can I do, is the question, what's the most skillful thing I can do? because each of us has unique talents and capacities and knowledge and knows people, et cetera, et cetera. So what's the most skillful thing I can do? How can I leverage my particular life and contacts and skills so as to have the maximum impact? And it's, Archimedes 2,000 years ago said, give me a lever long enough and a place to stand and I will move the earth. That's what we're looking at, our place to stand, our lever to move the earth in skillful, beneficial ways. And Buckminster Fuller, who was such a creative genius, who was well aware of the meta crisis before it even had a name, and actually said that one of the things we're going to require is a cultivation of sufficient people who are aware of the crisis and oriented towards solving it. And he said that in the 80s, 40 something years ago. And he introduced the concept of the trim tab being a metaphor for having maximum influence. Now, trim tab is a little rudder on the back of a rudder. You look at, say, a massive Boeing 747 that has a huge rudder on the back, and at 500 miles an hour, there's no way you can move that thing with mechanical pressure or hydraulics. But if you look on the back of the rudder of the 747, it's got a little rudder, and that's called a trim tab. So you move the trim tab one way, the rudder moves the other way, and the plane moves in the direction of the trim tab. And so the trim tabbing is looking for our place of optimal influence. And Buckminster Fuller on his grave had the epitaph, "Call me trim tab." so that's what we're looking to be. We're looking to be trim tabs, and looking to be a trim tab is a wisdom question. How do I become a trim tab? Which is another way of saying, how do I live my life so to be an optimal instrument of service? That's a master wisdom question. And we will presumably be asking it for the rest of our lives, and may enough people ask it to help heal and move us beyond the meta crisis and all the other challenges we face.
There's a classic discussion in integral circles around the relationship of ancient virtues to the four quadrants. And the good, the true, and the beautiful work very nicely. And then there's this notion of, well, what's the specific virtue associated with the so-called lower right quadrant? Sometimes people point to justice. I've done that myself in the sense that Socrates discusses justice in the Republic. Parsimony sometimes, but often to be provocative, partly because it doesn't sound like the other virtues, I've suggested that leverage is the lower right virtue, right? That's what makes a good system, is how much result you can get from how little input you have to put in. So I think the trim tab is a way of thinking about the specific virtue of the lower right quadrant. Can we arrange things interbehaviorally in a way where we can get a lot of result from the small things we're actually capable of controlling?
Yeah, oh, that's a beautiful, beautiful way of putting it, Layman. How can we enhance our impact and contribution, and acknowledging that, as Mahatma Gandhi said, anything you do may seem small or insignificant, it's still really important you do it.
You mentioned Mother Teresa at the beginning of the discussion, and I think there's a quote from her about you can't do great things, you can only do little things well, something like that.
Yeah, we can't all do great things, but we can all do little things with great love. May it be so.